There's a kind of silence. Not the kind that follows peace, but the kind that precedes truth. It happens the moment you ask them this. Can you tell me about a time you were truly wrong, and how it changed you? Just that. One question. Not accusatory. Not emotional. Just curious. But what follows is not an answer. What follows is a shift. A flicker. A fracture in the mask. Because the narcissist didn't prepare for this. They were ready for conflict. They were ready to argue, deflect, dominate. But what they weren't ready for was a mirror. This one question doesn't need explanation. It doesn't need proof or backup. Because if they were real, if there was someone behind the mask, they would answer. They would pause. Reflect. Maybe even say, yeah, I got it wrong. And it taught me something. But the narcissist? They can't. Not because they don't want to, but because they're not wired to. You see, they don't carry their mistakes. They erase them. They don't grow from their pain. They rewrite it. They don't self-reflect. They self-protect. And when you ask this one, simple, powerful question, you trigger something deeper than anger. You trigger terror. Because to admit they were wrong, to confess imperfection, it is to destroy the very foundation of the image they've spent their entire life building. And in that moment, you see it. The smile falters. The eyes lose focus. The conversation changes. They'll try to play it off. That's such a weird question. They'll laugh. Shrug. Maybe shift the focus back to you. Why are you even asking that? Are you trying to start something? And just like that, they're on the defense. Because you've done something rare. You've stepped out of the role. You're not the audience anymore. You're the mirror. And mirrors are dangerous. See, most people want to understand others. They ask questions because they care. But when you ask a narcissist to reflect, you're not having a conversation. You're shaking the walls of a false identity. A real person sees the question as an invitation. A narcissist sees it as an attack. They might smile wider, talk faster, or turn cold, withdrawn. As if your honesty is the problem. But it's not. It never was. The problem is, you're no longer playing. And they feel it. Because they thrive on chaos. On emotional reaction. On keeping you spinning. So you never stop to ask. Wait, what are they avoiding? Now you know. It's this moment. This silence. This very question. Because the truth is, they don't fear being disliked. They fear being seen. And nothing sees through illusion faster than stillness. So if you've ever asked someone something simple, and they turned it into an argument, if you've ever tried to understand, and were met with accusation, if you've ever spoken gently, and they responded with rage, then you've seen it. You've touched the mask. And for a second, it cracked. But here's what matters most. It's not about getting an answer. It's about witnessing the moment they can't give one. Because of that? That's where clarity begins. So stay with me. We're about to go deeper. Into the illusion, the reaction. And the mirror they'll do anything to avoid. Because once you understand what's behind that silence, you'll never mistake it for strength again. There is a truth about narcissists that most people never see. Until it's too late. They don't want to be loved. Not in the way you understand love. They want to be believed. Believed, without question. Without hesitation. Without evidence. Because their survival depends. Not on connection. But on control. And control begins with the story they tell. You see, narcissists are not who they appear to be. They are curators of identity, editors of perception, architects of illusion. From the outside, they're magnetic. They say all the right things. They make you feel special, seen, and chosen. But it's not love. It's performance. It's bait. And the hook? It is always the same. I am exactly who you've been waiting for. But the moment you try to look behind the curtain, the moment you ask for depth, for honesty, for something real, you threaten everything. Because underneath the illusion, there's nothing solid. No true self. No grounded core. Just fragments of other people's admiration, stitched together like a patchwork soul. They don't build character. They borrow charisma. They don't develop values. They mimic morality. Everything is performative. Every act of kindness has an audience. Every apology is a strategy. Every compliment is currency. And all of it, every smile, every story, every perfectly timed tear, it is designed for one outcome: to be believed. Because when you believe them, you validate the illusion. You feed the mask. You make it real. And without that, they begin to unravel. This is why narcissists don't just react to being questioned. They panic. Not in the way a child panics when they're caught in a lie, but in the way an actor panics when the lights go out and the stage disappears. You see, their identity is not built on being. It's built on seeming. They don't know who they are without someone reflecting it back to them. And that's the trap. Because if they've chosen you, you are now part of the illusion. Your love becomes evidence. Your loyalty becomes proof. Your forgiveness becomes permission. They'll say things like, "I thought you knew me better than that. I can't believe you'd think I'm capable of that. I guess I was wrong about you." And what they're really saying is, "How dare you stop believing in me?" But you didn't stop believing in hurting them. You stopped believing in saving yourself. And that they cannot forgive. Because in their world, your role isn't to challenge them. It's to affirm them. Endlessly. Blindly. Even when it hurts you. And when you step out of that role, when you question, doubt, or simply pause, you become dangerous. Because now, you're a mirror. And mirrors don't lie. They reflect. Have you ever had a moment when you saw through someone, and they knew it? When their charm shattered, their story unraveled, and you realized they weren't angry because you betrayed them. They were angry because you stopped believing. That's not betrayal. That's clarity. And clarity is the one thing a narcissist cannot manipulate. Because when the illusion is broken, when the script stops working, when your eyes stop shining with approval, they're no longer in control. They become exactly what they've always feared. Unremarkable. Exposed. Powerless. So remember this. They don't fear rejection. They expect it. They don't fear confrontation. They invite it. What they fear is someone who sees them and doesn't flinch. Someone who listens but doesn't believe. Someone who knows the story and walks away anyway. And that someone, it might just be you. So stay here. Because in the next segment, we're going to dissect the one psychological flaw they cannot override. And how a single question can unravel the story they've spent their entire life rehearsing. There's a question. Simple. Direct. Quiet. It doesn't sound like a weapon. But when spoken with clarity, it slices deeper than any accusation ever could. Because this question doesn't attack. It reveals. It bypasses their defenses. Slips past the charm. Dodges the manipulation. and lands directly on the thing they cannot survive. Truth. You see, narcissists don't fear confrontation. They're prepared for it. They're rehearsed. They have a script for every fight, every accusation, every challenge. They expect conflict. They thrive in it. Because as long as you're arguing, they're still controlling the narrative. But this question? It doesn't argue. It doesn't accuse. It just waits. And that's why it's so powerful. Let's build to it slowly. First, think about what they protect. Their story. Their image. Their curated identity. They don't want to be good. They want to be seen as good. They don't want growth. They want glory. So what happens when you stop playing along? What happens when you stop reacting? And start reflecting? Here's the question. What would you do if no one could ever be impressed by you again? Not loved. Not respected. Not even disliked. Just unimpressed. Sit with that for a moment. Now imagine asking it. The silence that follows. Because this question doesn't just challenge the ego. It exposes the dependency. Narcissists exist through the eyes of others. Their sense of self is not self-generated. It is borrowed, begged for, and performed. They don't feel alive unless someone is watching. So what happens? When does the audience disappear? What happens? When they're asked to exist? Without applause? The answer is in the reaction. They may smirk. They may scoff. They may call the question strange, irrelevant, or stupid. But they won't answer it. Because they can't. Not truthfully. Because to answer honestly would be to admit, I don't know who I am without validation. And that is the abyss they've been dancing around their whole life. Speech balloon. Has someone ever responded to your calm clarity with confusion, even fear? Like they suddenly weren't sure how to play the role they'd practiced for so long? That's what this question does. It doesn't break them. It shows them they were never whole. Because here's the secret. Their entire identity is scaffolding. It looks solid. But pull one beam, just one. And the whole thing begins to shake. And that one beam is this question. Because it doesn't just make them feel exposed. It reminds them of the void they've built everything on top of. And that void is unbearable. So what do? They may laugh. They may rage. They may go quiet. And then change the subject with surgical precision. But in that moment, watch their eyes. The flicker. The shift. The loss of script. Because now, they're not performing. They're scrambling. And that is your answer. Not in what they say, but in what they can't say. This is why you don't need to yell. You don't need to explain. You don't need a 12-slide presentation of all the ways they twisted your reality. You only need one question. One mirror. One moment. Where they are faced with a truth they've run from their entire life. Without control over how others see them. They don't know how to exist. And once you see that, once you really see it, you stop chasing closure. You stop seeking proof. You stop trying to make them understand. Because now, you understand. Their silence is the confession. Their reaction is the truth. And your stillness? That's the power they can't touch. So if you ever find yourself wondering, did I imagine it? Was it really that bad? Should I give them one more chance to explain? Ask the question. Then say nothing. And listen. Not to their words, but to their fear. Because of that fear, you'll hear it all. Not who they say they are, but they've never been willing to be. And that It is what finally sets you free. There's a silence that's louder than any scream. A stillness more unsettling than confrontation. And for the narcissist, that silence is the beginning of their undoing. Because narcissists don't just seek control. They survive on it. Control over the narrative. Control over your emotions. Control over how you see them. But here's what they never expect. You. Not reacting. Not explaining. Not defending. Not trying to be understood. Just being still. And in that stillness, their entire structure begins to collapse. You see, they've crafted their illusion around movement. Your movement. Your emotional labor. Your endless attempts to resolve the confusion they created. They set the fire. Then call you crazy for trying to put it out. But when you stop rushing into the flames, they panic. Because now, the game has no player. No opponent. No feedback loop. No emotional charge to feed off. Have you ever noticed that the more calm and grounded you became, the more chaotic they got? That's not an accident. That's the collapse. Because narcissists need chaos to feel control. They poke, provoke, press buttons. Not to solve anything, but to keep you spinning. Because as long as you're spinning, you're not seeing clearly. But once you step off the ride, once you say, I don't need this to make sense anymore. I don't need your version of the story. I choose peace, even if you call it selfish. They lose their grip. And suddenly, the mask slips. Not in anger, but in fear. Because you've become the one thing they cannot handle. Unreachable. You're no longer hooked. No longer predictable. No longer emotionally available for the dance. And here's what they'll do next. They might bait you. Try to reignite the dynamic with questions like, why are you being so cold? Since when did you stop caring? Or the classic guilt trip. I guess I never really mattered to you after all. But don't miss the truth hiding inside those words. What they're really saying is, you're not playing your role anymore. And I don't know what to do. Because the moment you stop reacting, you stop being useful. To them. You're no longer the mirror. No longer the emotional sponge. No longer the chaos absorber. And that's terrifying for someone who has built their entire identity on the ability to shape how others feel. This is the collapse. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just a quiet, unraveling. One boundary at a time. One breath of detachment. One moment where you choose not to engage. Mini hook. Stick around, because in a moment, we'll talk about the one subtle shift in your nervous system that narcissists always notice, and why that's your secret weapon. Let's be clear. You're not being mean. You're not being spiteful. You're reclaiming something sacred. Your energy. Because emotional clarity isn't cold. It's clean. And clean boundaries? They terrify narcissists. Why? Because they can't twist them. They can't argue with silence. They can't manipulate a person who's no longer trying to prove their worth. That's why they call you distant. Disconnected. Even cruel. But none of that is about you. It's about their reflection, no longer bouncing back. And here's what's truly powerful. You don't have to make a speech. You don't have to win the conversation. You don't need the last word. Your grounded presence says it all. Because once you stop being emotionally available to the drama, you start becoming emotionally available to yourself. To peace. To intuition. To the truth. And in that space, something beautiful begins. You heal. You regulate. You return to yourself. Not the version they tried to mold, but the one who was always whole underneath the noise. Have you reached this space before? That quiet moment where you realized you weren't cold. You were just done explaining your warmth to someone who never wanted to feel it? Drop a comment. Your story might be the mirror someone else needs today. Because here's the truth. The collapse of their control. It isn't something you orchestrate with revenge. It's something that happens when you rise into a version of yourself they never thought you'd become. Unshakable. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't accuse. You didn't explain yourself for the 100th time. You simply didn't react. And that silence? It spoke louder than every argument you've ever had. Because for the narcissist, your non-reaction isn't peace. It's punishment. Not because you're doing anything to them, but because you're no longer doing anything for them. And in their world, that's betrayal. You see, narcissists don't experience relationships the way emotionally healthy people do. They don't bond through mutual understanding or shared vulnerability. They bond through control. And when they can't control you, they feel exposed. Not in the way you and I understand vulnerability, but in a way that feels like psychological annihilation. Because without control, they have no identity. No anchor. No way to maintain the illusion. They've spent years, maybe decades, crafting a persona. The hero. The misunderstood genius. The perfect partner. The victim of toxic people. But the moment you step out of their story, that persona begins to fall apart. Have you ever gone silent and watched someone unravel because they didn't know how to spin it anymore? That's the power of stillness. Not as a weapon, but as a mirror. Because when you stop feeding the performance, you force them to sit in something they've avoided their whole life. Themselves. And what do they find there? Emptiness. Shame. Fear. Not fear of you, but fear of being ordinary. Fear of being unseen. Fear of being irrelevant. Because without someone to validate their illusion, they don't exist. It sounds dramatic, but it's real. They've spent their entire life outsourcing their self-worth, borrowing confidence from others' admiration, stealing identity through your reflection. And now, the mirror is gone. That's why they spiral. Why do they smear? Why do they suddenly warn everyone else about you? Because they need to shift the attention. They need to rewrite the story. They need to be the victim, again. But the irony? The more they scramble to regain control, the more obvious it becomes that they've lost it. You haven't said a word, but your silence has shouted the truth. You no longer own space in my nervous system. And for someone who survives on emotional dominance, that's the most devastating message of all. Stay with me, because in a moment, we'll explore why your quiet detachment is not just resistance, it's freedom. Now here's the part they'll never admit. They know the mask has slipped. They know you see them. They know the illusion is broken, at least with you. And that is terrifying. Because narcissists don't need everyone to believe the act. They just need enough people to keep it going. But once one person steps out of the trance, it threatens the whole system. Especially when that person doesn't rage, doesn't chase, doesn't beg for understanding. Because now, you're unpredictable. And unpredictability is the one thing their control can't control. You've become the wild card. The mirror that won't lie. The silence that won't soothe their ego. And they don't know what to do with that. So they'll try to provoke. They'll fish for a reaction. They'll say things like, I guess you were never who I thought you were. Wow, you've really changed. I always knew you were unstable. But don't take the bait. Because what they're really saying is, I can't get to you anymore. And that scares me. See, exposure doesn't always happen in public. It doesn't need to involve proof, confrontation, or drama. Sometimes, exposure is simply this. You see them. Clearly. Calmly. Completely. And you don't flinch. You don't explain it away. You don't pretend it was all your fault. You don't cling to the version of them they sold you. You just know. And in that knowing, you reclaim your power. Because once you've seen the truth, you can never unsee it. And once you stop reacting, you stop participating. You step out of the illusion and into your reality. A reality where you are not the villain. You are not crazy. You are not too much. You're just someone who woke up. And that is the kind of exposure they cannot survive. So tell me, was there a moment when your silence revealed more than your words ever could? Share it in the comments. Because your story might help someone realize they're not cold. They're just finally free. There's a moment. Not when the narcissist leaves. Not when the chaos ends. But when you realize you've come home. Not to a place. Not to a person. But to yourself. And that's the moment the healing begins. Not the loud kind. Not the kind with applause, or closure, or even understanding. But the quiet kind. The kind that settles into your bones and whispers. You survived. And not just that. You remembered who you were all along. You see, narcissistic abuse doesn't just wound your heart. It fractures your sense of self. You start to doubt your memory. Your feelings. Your worth. You twist yourself in knots to be enough. You shrink your truth to keep the peace. You hand over your clarity. In hopes that maybe, just maybe, they'll finally see you. But they never did. Because it was never about seeing you. It was about using you. As a mirror. As supply. As a stage to project the version of themselves they needed to believe in. And when you stopped reflecting that illusion, you became dangerous. But not because you changed. Because you woke up. And now? You're here. Have you ever had that moment, where instead of feeling broken, you felt clear? Drop it in the comments. Your story could be someone else's mirror, reflecting hope instead of confusion. See, the truth is, you were never too much. You were never too sensitive. You were never the problem. You were just real, in a world where they were pretending. And when someone's survival depends on illusion, your truth will always feel like a threat. But now, the threat is gone. Because you've taken your power back. Not through revenge. Not through exposure. But through detachment. And this kind of detachment? It's not cold. It's not numb. It's sacred. It's the quiet knowing that you no longer need to prove anything. To them. To anyone. It's the shift from survival to sovereignty. Maybe it looks like blocking that number without guilt. Maybe it looks like setting a boundary and not explaining why. Maybe it looks like sitting in silence and realizing your nervous system is no longer on fire. Whatever it looks like. That's your return. To self. To safety. To truth. And here's the most beautiful part. You didn't just walk away. You reclaimed something. Your voice. Your peace. Your wholeness. You stopped chasing closure from someone who cannot give it. And instead, you created closure for yourself. And that is power. Real power. The kind that doesn't need to scream. The kind that doesn't need to win. The kind that simply exists, rooted in clarity, calm, and inner truth. Because healing from narcissistic abuse isn't about being unbothered. It's about being unhooked. Unhooked from their shame. Their blame. Their illusion. You no longer need to justify your boundaries. You no longer need to beg for understanding. You no longer wait for the apology that will never come. You've moved on. Not just physically. But energetically. You now measure love by presence, not performance. Connection by consistency, not charisma. Peace by how quiet your inner world feels, not how loud someone else demands to be. So if no one has told you this today, let me be the first. You're doing the work. You're walking through the fire. And you're coming out whole. This is your return to self. Not the version of you they wanted, but the one they could never control. The one who rises from the silence. Not as a victim, but as a mirror that no longer reflects their illusion. If this video gave you clarity, if it reminded you of your strength, if it helped you name something you've carried in silence, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs the reminder. And hit subscribe so you never walk this journey alone again. Because here, on Unmasking Personality, we don't chase narcissists. We choose ourselves. We stop trying to fix what was never ours to heal. And we start building lives rooted in truth, connection, and emotional sovereignty. You were never too broken. You were simply too powerful for someone who needed you small to feel significant. But now, you rise. And this is where your real story begins.